Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this sharedserviceslink.com radio interview with Mary Schaeffer of Accounts Payable Now and Tomorrow. Today, we are going to be discussing accounts payable fraud, how big is the problem? So we'll kick off with some definitions about what this looks like. How serious is the problem? Are these high or low-tech crimes? Is the risk internal or entirely external? And what basic steps can companies take to protect themselves against fraud? So, but before we get into that, let me introduce Mary. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So Mary, just to give our listeners some background, is Editorial Director, Editor-in-Chief of Accounts Payable Now and Tomorrow. And this is a monthly e-zine containing the most up-to-date accounts payable advice. This is based on her over 20 years' experience in the corporate financial community. She's become a recognized expert on accounts payable issues and has authored 15 business books, including one called Fraud in Accounts Payable. And she will also be joining us next week as a speaker in Atlanta at our Summit for Leaders in Finance Shared Services conference. So if you don't get enough today, then you can definitely pick her brain then next week, I'm sure. So thanks again for joining us today, Mary. So as I mentioned, let's kind of, when we talk about fraud, it can mean different things to different people. So can you kick us off with a definition of what this actually means?
Sure. When I think of accounts payable fraud, in my mind I also use the word payment fraud. So it includes all sorts of tasks or manipulations or games or whatever you want to call it that people play, and it can take many types of forms. It can be check fraud. It can be electronic payment fraud. It can be invoice fraud, people sending in phony invoices. It can also be any sort of manipulations that somebody with access to the accounts payable files or the master vendor files commits or perpetrates so that the payment doesn't go to the intended recipient but to someone who it doesn't belong to.
Right, okay. Thanks for that. So how serious is the problem?
It's more serious than people think. I have 3 sets of statistics which I'm going to throw out at our listeners now real quickly. What I like about these statistics is they all come from different places. They all are surveys of different types of financial professionals, but they all tell the same story. So the first set of statistics comes from PricewaterhouseCoopers, and they interviewed very senior level executives, and they asked them how many of them had experienced significant crime, they didn't say exactly what it was, within the last 2 years in their organizations. And 43% said yes. 2 years, 43% significant crime. The second set of statistics comes from what I call my folks. These are the people who work in accounts payable, controllers, assistant controllers, some CFOs who have their hands on the money. And we surveyed them, and we asked them in the last 10 years in their organization, had they any sort of accounts payable crime. And we told them, you know, leave out the petty stuff like somebody put in for a movie on their expense reimbursement form. And in this survey, 84% of them said yes, they'd experienced it. And a colleague of mine said, rather cynically, although I happen to agree with her, yeah, and the other 16% just haven't found it yet. And finally, And finally, and this is kind of heartbreaking, if you will, but the Association of Financial Professionals once a year interviews their members and asks them about actual or attempted fraud. And roughly 70% of them, 70% of the organizations had actual or attempted fraud tried against them. Not to say it was all successful, but basically what this says to me is we all have to be serious. We all have to take this problem seriously.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, as you say, I think it does seem from those statistics as something that people just haven't really taken as seriously as they ought to be moving forward. So, I mean, do you see any trends emerging in the type of fraud that's being committed?
One of the new trends, it breaks my heart to say, are frauds that are focusing on using the electronic era. They're focused on using the Internet. And these are focused, if you will, many of them on accounts payable. And the reason for that is kind of simple. It's where the money is. So these electronic payment frauds, in the United States we call them ACH, involve typically people in the third world, Eastern Europe, getting information on companies and where they have their bank accounts, and then doing something what we call corporate account hijacking.
Okay.
To take over people's computers. I know this sounds really high tech, and but they're focused, and what they're doing. Many of them is going to social media sites like Facebook and LinkedIn and figuring out, who they should be targeting.
Right, I see. Okay, so I mean, as you said, that does sound like very high tech crime. I mean, do we need to be concerned about kind of the old-fashioned low tech crimes as well?
Yes, we do. The old tech crimes, unfortunately, are still with us. When I talk about the Association of Financial Professionals, the most common crime in their survey was check fraud. Now, I realize across the pond, you're a little bit more advanced than we are over here in the States. You don't make as many paper check payments as we do by a long shot. But in the United States, check fraud, it's been with us forever, and it's still out there, and it's something we need to be concerned about, and it is a big problem. At the same time, we also have what I call the petty stuff, and this stuff has been going on. It's been going on for 20, 30 years. I don't know how long, but I've known about it for 20 years. And the only reason that I think it's still going on is that it works. And these are frauds where the crooks call up and they try and get your copier number, and then they sell you they send cheap toner and cheap paper for your copier machine, and then they send invoices at an inflated level. They send phony invoices for small dollar items, for ads, for yellow pages ads, for ads on the internet, all sorts of stuff that it's not a high dollar amount or a high pound amount, if you will, but so sometimes it flies under the radar. So we've got to be concerned about both the high level stuff, but we can't let up our guard on the low level stuff.
Right.
Anna, can I go back to the high tech and just talk a little bit about how it's committed?
Of course you can, yeah, definitely.
Okay, because I think this is important, and people think it's coming from out of the blue, but it's not, and I think everyone needs to be especially concerned about it. And what these crooks are doing is they're targeting many mid-sized companies, many school districts, municipalities, because maybe they're not as, or they think they're not as sophisticated, and they don't know the latest banking protections, if you will. So what we're seeing is what we call corporate account hijacking, where they send an email that has a malicious link in it or an attachment that someone opens, and when they either click on the link or open the attachment, what's called malware is downloaded, and it allows the crooks to capture your keystrokes, and then with your keystrokes they learn what your bank is, what your bank account number is, your user ID, and your password, and they can hijack your account and go in and pretend they're you and issue all sorts of payments. And that is kind of the latest, but it's not something that they're only going after the big companies, because they're doing a decent but not great job of protecting themselves, but they're going after the mid-sized folks who maybe aren't as up to date on this. And in the United States, anyway, we had a whole series where they went after school districts.
Right. And how long does it take to notice that this kind of thing is going on?
Well, ideally, people are checking their bank accounts, doing a bank reconciliation every day, but not everybody does. No. That's one of the things we tell people to protect against this sort of crime. Check your bank do your bank recs every day, and if there are any unauthorized payments on there, call your bank immediately, because this is really a time when time is of the essence.
Right, I see. So, I mean, as you said, I mean, both high-tech and low-tech crimes are sort of seemingly on the increase.
Yes.
But, I mean, is the risk entirely external?
No. It would be nice to think that it was entirely external, but we're at risk internally also. And no one likes to think that their employees would steal from them. It's kind of unnerving, and most employees won't steal from them. But there's another statistic that comes from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and they do a survey every 2 years, and it's called the Report to the Nations. And they survey about what they call occupational fraud. I call it employee fraud. And what they found out over and over again is that most internal crime is committed by long-term trusted employees, because we let our guard down, so maybe we let some of our internal controls go by the wayside. So everybody we have to do everything that we do, our controls have to be against everyone. Now, I was giving a talk one time, and I said this, and I got a note later from a young woman who was listening, and she was not happy with me, and she wrote, she said, I am insulted by what you said. I've been with my company for 20 years. I would never steal from them. And she is correct, and most people do fall into that category. They would not steal from their employers. The problem is we don't know who those few bad apples are. We can't tell them from the rest of the crowd, so we've got to have controls around everything. But don't be lulled into complacency of thinking it couldn't happen at your company. Unfortunately, it could.
Well, that's certainly food for thought. So what kind of basic steps can a company take to protect themselves against, the variety of frauds that we've discussed today?
There are a number of things that you can do. The first one, and this may sound trite, but I think it's very important, is just number one, be aware that this could happen to you. Don't be lulled into could only happen to somebody else. Eventually, it will happen at your company. So be aware that it could happen. The second one is make sure that you put in place strong internal controls and have appropriate segregation of duties. And we need to do this to protect ourselves both against internal crime and external crime. There's no we only have to do this halfway. In the States, sometimes people will say to me, well, I see there's all this rise in ACH crime, ACH payment fraud. Can I let my guard down on check fraud? And do I have to use positive pay, which we use to protect against check fraud? And the answer is yes, you still have to keep your guard up there. The next item is, and not many people are doing this, but it should be a best practice, and it is pretty cheap, and that is get a separate computer to use for your online banking and use it for that and nothing else. Don't look at email on that computer. Don't access the internet on that computer. Don't surf the web on that computer. Just use it for your online banking. If you do that, there's no way that there can be an account takeover. And think about what a PC costs. In the States, you can get one for less than $1,000. I'm sure it's comparable on your side of the pond. It's not a lot of money to protect yourself. The next item, again, going back to the employees, is use best practices. Many frauds start with an honest mistake. You pay somebody twice, let's say, for example, and when the vendor gets that second payment or the employee gets that second T&E reimbursement, they think, oh, these people don't know what they're doing. If I invoice them twice, they'll pay me twice, and that's how it starts. So using best practices is critical if we want to protect our organization. And finally, my last piece of advice is that we need to keep up to date on new frauds that are developing. Unfortunately, the crooks who are focusing on accounts payable or payments are increasingly sophisticated. We still have the dopes out there who, do the dumb things, but we have a group of increasingly smart people who are focused on getting their hands on your company's money, and they are continually coming up with new ways to do it. I like to say that it's a game of cat and mouse. The crooks come up with a fraud. The financial institutions develop a process or a product to protect against it, and the crooks quickly become aware of that, and then they develop a new fraud. And so we've got this kind of ongoing game. So even if you're up to date today, 6 months from now you might not be. So keep up to date, talk to your banks, find out what products they have, and just continually be alert.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that, Mary. That's been a really, really interesting session to kind of hear about what kind of frauds are out there, and certainly I'm sure a lot of our listeners will be able to take away your advice on those very basic, very doable, actionable steps that you said to protect themselves against fraud. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.